In today's video, we'll look at the question of who was Angulimala, and we'll look at this story of this mass murderer who eventually became an enlightened Buddhist ascetic. If you're new to this channel of mine and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So today we're going to look at the figure of Angulimala, a very famous figure in early Buddhism, for being somebody who had a very, very bad beginning, but became eventually an enlightened person. So what we're going to do here is I'll describe the general story, and then I'll go into a bit more about the background, and finally we'll end up with some recent scholarly speculations about Angulimala at the end. Now, to begin with, his name, Angulimala, is really an epithet. It means finger garland, or garland, we might say garland of fingers. Angulimala was a brigand or a murderer who would string together the fingers off of each of his victims into a garland that he hung around his neck. At least that's the story. And he apparently lived in the forest near some communities and basically terrorized the communities because people who would wander into the forest through the pathways that led through that forest would be routinely killed. And so he was a problem, a terror for the local community. And it's said that at one point the Buddha wanted to pass through that forest, wanted to walk on a path that led through Angulimala's territory. And he was strongly advised by many of the people in the towns not to do this, that his life was in danger, that you couldn't simply wander through Angulimala's territory and get out alive. But nevertheless, so it's said, the Buddha decided that he was going to walk through this territory anyway. And so he set off. And it's also said that when he did this, Angulimala saw him coming from a distance, saw the Buddha off in the distance, and was, you might expect, somewhat annoyed. He sort of thought, what is this ascetic coming through my territory for? He thinks he's gonna best me, and I'm gonna show him he shouldn't be walking through here. So Angulimala, it's said, got on his shield and his sword, got on his helmet, and went out to kill the Buddha. And it's said that he ran after the Buddha. But it's also in the story that no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't catch up to the Buddha. And this is expressed as a kind of a miracle within the story. Now, from my own point of view, I don't necessarily see why this has to be miraculous. However, the way it's described is miraculous in the sense that no matter how fast Angulimala ran and the Buddha simply walked, the Buddha always stayed ahead of him. And this was shocking to Angulimala, and eventually Angulimala decided to stop, and because he couldn't run anymore. And so he stopped and he told the Buddha, he said, stop moving, Buddha. I guess he probably wouldn't have known his name, but stop moving. But the Buddha keeps walking. And the Buddha says something quite surprising to Angulimala. He says, I've stopped, Angulimala, now you stop. And this shocked Angulimala because Angulimala thought to himself, he said, at least it's put this way in the text, that these Sakyan ascetics don't lie, they always tell the truth. In other words, he seems to have known that the Buddha was a Sakyan ascetic. He realized that this Sakyan ascetic would not be lying to him, but on the other hand, it's clear that he, Angulimala, has stopped and the Buddha keeps walking, and yet the Buddha says that he has stopped and that Angulimala should stop. And so this confuses Angulimala a great deal. So what's going on here? Well, this is, in the words of Analayo, one great interpreter of the early texts, it's sort of a Zen koan of a certain kind, although unlike many Zen koans, this one has a pretty straightforward answer. What the Buddha is saying is that he himself has stopped by stopping greed, hatred, and delusion. He's stopped by stopping violence, by stopping harming other people. He's stopped by being in control of his mind, by stopping the kind of turmoil and hullabaloo and hubbub that all of us have in our ordinary, unawakened minds. He's stopped by being at peace. Whereas Angulimala has not stopped. He continues to harm people. He continues not to be at peace. He's somebody who the Buddha says to him, and indeed in response the Buddha says basically, that he Angulimala, seems incapable of stopping to harm people and stopping killing people. And this exchange seems to have opened Angulimala's eyes, and so it's said that Angulimala puts down his weapons. Now, to me, the story needs a little bit of interpretation because it doesn't seem clear exactly why Angulimala is so overcome here. I think, but perhaps, at least this is my interpretation, Angulimala is very impressed by the Buddha's courage. That perhaps he, Angulimala, had thought of people who were non-harming, who held this philosophy of non-harm and non-killing. Perhaps he thought of them as being people who were weak and not courageous. But here he sees somebody who is clearly filled with courage, who is somebody who is besting him in a certain respect, and yet does so through a philosophy, through a dharma of non-harming. And I think that perhaps is what was most effective. In any event, Angulimala decides to become a monastic at this point. Now, as a monastic, Angulimala now has to go into the surrounding villages on a regular daily basis in order to beg for alms. That's how monastics get food. It's how they get their sustenance. And it's said that, as you might expect, when Angulimala would do this, when he would go into the surrounding towns to beg for food, he was regularly abused and things were thrown at him and he was called names because, of course, people didn't like him. They thought of him as a murderer, which he indeed had been. Perhaps he had even killed people that they knew or that were in their families or friends. So as a result, Angulimala had to, in a certain sense, do penance for his past bad deeds. He had to, we might say, expiate the bad karma that he had accumulated over that lifetime. And this may be related to the next event, the next most important event in the Angulimala story, which it is said that one day when Angulimala was on his alms round, he went by and saw a woman who was in labor and having a very difficult labor. And while she was in labor, the Angulimala decided to go back to the Buddha and tell him about this. And the Buddha heard what Angulimala said and gave him a piece of important advice, or told him to do something. Now, the way the Buddha told him is somewhat surprising and questionable, and we'll get to that in a moment, but it has to do with a basic idea in ancient India of something called a truth act. In ancient India, there was this idea that simply through speaking truth, one could make miraculous things happen, or at least important and difficult things happen. Some scholars believe that the Truth Act actually is something that began in the Vedas, which are texts, pre-Buddhist texts that basically originate all of Indian Dharma and philosophy, perhaps 1,000 years or many hundreds of years before the Buddha's lifetime. But in any event, the idea of a Truth Act seems to have reached its height of importance within the Buddhist context. And so basically what the Buddha tells Angulimala is that he should go to this woman who is in labor and say that he is going to speak the truth, that he has never killed a living being in his entire life, and by that truth may she and her child be safe. Now, the weird thing here, of course, is that the Buddha knows full well that Angulimala has killed plenty of people in his lifetime, and so this wouldn't work. And Angulimala says as much to the Buddha. He says, well, no, I can't say that because I've actually killed a lot of people. I'm not exactly sure why the Buddha tells him this. This is very strange. I think it's not as I recall, it's not in all recensions of this particular sutta, so this may be an example of a textual corruption of some kind. At any event, the Buddha then amends his request or his point and says to Aṅgulimāla to tell the young woman, this woman giving birth, that he, Aṅgulimāla, has never killed anyone after having been born into the noble birth. That is to say, after having become a Buddhist monastic. Or perhaps having become a stream enterer. It's not really entirely, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. The point is that what the Buddha is telling Aṅgulimāla to do, on the one hand, of course, is to do a truth act that will help save the baby's life, and the mother's life too, perhaps, but also, in so doing, he is suggesting that Aṅgulimāla go publicly to say that he has renounced violence, that he has renounced killing, that he has changed his way of living. And that perhaps, we might argue, in so doing, he may make life easier for himself with the lay people who are around him, because now they've heard him, they haven't just seen him walking on alms round, but they've heard him publicly say that he has never killed anyone after having changed, and presumably that he would therefore never do so again. At any rate, whatever the reason is, Aṅgulimāla goes and does this, and the baby is born safely, and both the mother and the baby are safe. And indeed, down to the present day, Aṅgulimāla's utterance here is used as a kind of a protective mantra for women who are pregnant and in labor in many Buddhist countries. It's interesting to note, having said all this is the story of Aṅgulimāla's life now, but having said all of this, it's interesting to note that after Aṅgulimāla, the Buddha did in fact lay down a ruling in the Vinaya, which is the texts that describe the rules, the laws of Buddhist monastic life. He laid down a rule that robbers and brigands like Aṅgulimāla were not to be ordained within the monastery. They were not to become monks. Presumably this is because having ordained Aṅgulimāla caused about a large uproar within the lay community, which I think we've seen. And it perhaps caused enough uproar that the Buddha decided that a rule should be laid down that although this worked once, it's not to be the sort of thing that they will do in the future. Now, having given the story of Aṅgulimāla, I want to turn to a recent speculation by one leading scholar of early Buddhism, Richard Gombrich. Richard Gombrich has argued in a paper a while back that Aṅgulimāla may have been what he calls a proto-Shaivite, that is to say, an early devotee of Shiva within a Vedic Brahmin tradition. That is to say that he was performing ritual murders on behalf of Shiva and decorating himself with the fingers of the murder victims as a kind of a religious enterprise. And that therefore the story of Aṅgulimāla may record a conversion of somebody from being a devotee of Shiva to being a monastic under the Buddha's tutelage, we might say. Now this is a surprising and interesting hypothesis. However, having said this, it's important also to note that Richard Gombrich's hypothesis here has gotten a lot of pushback from scholars, in particular scholars of early Shaivism, of the early tradition of Shiva worship. In particular, it's been said that this claim of Richard Gombrich doesn't really work because it's 1,000 years too early. That is to say, Shiva worship of this kind did not occur until really the early centuries of the Common Era, perhaps 3rd, 4th, 5th century of the Common Era, well after the time at which the Buddha would have composed this text, or this would have happened. And also it's said that while such practitioners did indeed decorate themselves with such things as human bones, those bones were taken from they say, a mortuary context and not from ritual murders. That is to say, they would have been taken from dead bodies that have been laid out in the open, in the same way that, let's say, Buddhist monastics would contemplate such bodies. These Shaivite practitioners would take, let's say, bones to decorate themselves. And so, if these responses are correct, then probably Richard Gombrich isn't right about this, but at least it's a hypothesis that's interesting to consider and might, for all that, be true. For me, one of the many fascinating things about this story, however, is the interweaving of these two ethical principles. The ethical principle, on the one hand, of non-harming, which is perhaps the paramount one in the stories, but also the secondary ethical principle of truth-telling. Because after all, it's Angulimala's awareness that these Shakyan ascetics tell the truth. It's that awareness that leads him to stop and think twice when the Buddha says this weird thing to him of, "I've stopped, but you haven't." He doesn't simply think that the Buddha is lying or making some foolish statement. He thinks there must be some truth to this, what could it be? And that's really what opens his eyes. And then, of course, most pertinently, we have the truth act later on within Angulimala's life, his statement of the truth that he no longer is killing anybody and has not killed any living thing since he was born into this life as a Buddhist monastic. And it's this weaving, I think, of nonviolence and truth that makes this a very deep story within the Buddhist tradition, and one that is still popular to this day. Now, later on in the Buddhist tradition, we have a sort of a different idea of truth, which is expressed in the notion of two truths. And I did an earlier video on that change, and indeed on the idea of the doctrine of two truths and how it developed. And if you haven't seen it or you want to see it again, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos, take a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and get something in return for that support. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.